He was never meant to rule Rome. He wasn't even supposed to speak for it. Marcus Tullius Cicero was born in 106 BC, not in the eternal city itself among the hereditary aristocrats whose names were carved into the consular fasti, but in the small provincial town of Arpinum. It was the same nest that produced the coarse soldier Gaius Marius. But if Marius was the embodiment of the province's military might, Cicero became the embodiment of their intellectual power. His family belonged to the equestrian order, wealthy and educated, but denied access to the highest circles of power, which were reserved for the old senatorial nobility. He was a homo novus, a new man, an upstart in the eyes of the aristocrats, who had to forge his path to the top not through noble ancestry, but solely through the power of his own genius. And his genius manifested early. He was not a warrior, he was a man of words. From childhood, he was obsessed with language, rhetoric, and philosophy. His father, noticing his son's incredible abilities, did everything to provide him with the best education. He moved the family to Rome and hired the finest Greek tutors for young Marcus and his brother Quintus. Cicero absorbed knowledge like a sponge. He devoured the works of Greek philosophers, poets, and historians. But his true passion was the forum. He would spend hours, even days there, listening to the speeches of the greatest orators of his time, such as Lucius Licinius Crassus and Marcus Antonius, grandfather of the future Triumvirate. He studied their gestures, their intonations, their methods of persuasion. He understood that in Rome, where all politics were conducted in public before the eyes of the crowd, the word was as much a weapon as a legionary's sword. And he decided to make that weapon his own. His career began not in the Senate, but in the courtroom. In Rome, advocacy was the primary springboard into high politics. A young, ambitious man could make a name for himself by defending an innocent person in a high-profile case, or prosecuting a powerful scoundrel. Cicero chose the most dangerous path. In 81 BC, while the chilling terror of Sulla's dictatorship still lingered in Rome, he took on a case that all other advocates had refused. He decided to defend a certain Sextus Roscius of Ameria, who was accused of parricide, the most heinous crime in Roman law. This was no ordinary criminal case. Behind the accusation stood Sulla's all-powerful favorite and freedman, Chrysogonus, who had actually murdered Roscius's father to seize his property during the proscriptions. To accuse Chrysogonus meant challenging Sulla himself, whose name still made people turn pale. It was professional suicide, and potentially literal suicide as well. And the 26-year-old Cicero, an unknown lawyer, dared to do it. His speech in defense of Roscius became a masterpiece. He did not dare to attack Sulla directly. Instead, he built his defense on a brilliant distinction. He praised the great Sulla, the savior of the Republic, and contrasted him with his, quote, servants like Chrysogonus, who exploited his name to commit lawless acts. He thundered in court. He appealed to justice, to the old Roman virtues, and did so with such skill that the jury could not refuse him. Roscius was acquitted. Cicero became famous overnight. But he knew perfectly well that he had made a deadly enemy. Immediately after the trial, under the pretext of he prudently left Rome for 2 years, traveling to Greece to escape the wrath of the powerful Chrysogonus. These 2 years became his in Athens and Rhodes. He studied under the greatest rhetoricians and philosophers of his time. He honed his style, shedding his youthful exuberance and developing the renowned, harmonious, and powerful eloquence that would become his trademark. When he returned to Rome after Sulla's death, he was no longer just a talented lawyer. He was a polished politician, an intellectual, and a master of the word. Stories of individuals who challenge all-powerful tyrants, armed only with their intellect and courage, have inspired humanity for centuries. They show that even in the darkest of times, a single voice speaking the truth can prove stronger than entire legions. Our channel is dedicated to such stories, the stories of geniuses, rebels, and strategists who were not afraid to go against the grain. To ensure you don't miss our features on other great figures who changed the course of history, make sure you are subscribed. Now let's return to Cicero, who was yet to prove that in Rome, the word could still triumph over the sword. He began his ascent up the Cursus Honorum. He was elected quaestor and sent to Sicily, where he proved to be an incredibly honest and effective administrator. He earned the love and respect of the Sicilians, which provided him with a new weapon for his next great battle. Upon returning to Rome, he took on the most sensational case of his time, the prosecution of Gaius Verus. Verus, the former governor of Sicily, was a monster, the embodiment of the corruption and tyranny of the Roman aristocracy. For 3 years, he systematically plundered the province, seizing works of art, money, and harvests. He tortured and executed Roman citizens. The best lawyers defended him, and the entire senatorial nobility was on his side. Defeating him seemed impossible. Cicero took on this case not just for fame. For him, it was a battle for the soul of the Republic. He wanted to prove that the law still existed in Rome, that even the most powerful aristocrat could not escape justice. He spent months in Sicily, personally gathering evidence and interviewing hundreds of witnesses. He amassed such a mountain of evidence that Verus's defense collapsed on the very first day of the trial. Cicero delivered only one but devastating speech. Verus, without waiting for a verdict, fled from Rome. Cicero became a hero. He had defeated the Hydra of corruption. He became the most famous lawyer in Rome. And now the path to the very top, the consulship, was open to him. He, the quote from Arpinum, was about to become the head of the Roman state. He did not yet know that by reaching this peak, he would find himself on the edge of a precipice. Cicero's path to the consulship was like climbing a steep, almost vertical cliff. He fought for every handhold, using his entire arsenal of talents. His impeccable reputation, the connections he had built over years of legal practice, and, of course, his divine eloquence. But the main obstacle was an invisible wall erected by the Roman aristocracy around the highest offices. The Senate was their exclusive club, and they looked down with contempt on this homo novus, this new man from Arpinum, who dared to aspire to what they believed was theirs by birthright. They called him a foreigner, an inquilinus, essentially a tenant in the city of Rome. But Cicero was relentless. He understood that to win, he needed more than just popular support. He needed the backing of a part of the aristocracy. And he, a genius of compromise, began to weave his web of alliances, convincing the moderate faction of senators that he, an outsider yet devoted to Republican ideals, was the best defense against the real threats, from radical demagogues below and from all-powerful generals like Pompey above. In 63 BC, at the age of 43, he achieved his goal. Marcus Tullius Cicero was elected consul. It was an unprecedented triumph. For the first time in 30 years, a new man had reached the highest office in the state, and he had done so at the minimum legal age. He was on top of the world. He had achieved everything he had ever dreamed of. But fate, as if to test his mettle, had prepared for his consulship the most terrible ordeal the Republic had faced since the time of Sulla. The name of this ordeal was Lucius Sergius Catilina. Catiline was Cicero's complete opposite, his dark twin. He too was a patrician, but from an impoverished and decaying family. In his youth, he had been one of Sulla's bloodiest henchmen, making a fortune from the proscriptions. He was a man of monstrous energy, incredible charisma, and absolute amorality. Rumors haunted him of murdering his own brother, seducing a Vestal virgin, and participating in horrific orgies. He had tried several times to become consul, but lost each time, squandering his fortune on campaigns and accumulating massive debts. Driven to desperation, he decided to seize power by force. He gathered around him an army of the desperate, men like himself, ruined aristocrats, Sulla's veterans who had lost their lands, and city plebs dreaming of debt cancellation and plunder. His plan was simple and terrifying: to set fire to Rome in several places on the same day to create panic, assassinate the consuls, including Cicero, and seize control. This was not just a political conspiracy. It was a plan for total terror, designed to plunge the Republic into bloody chaos. From the beginning of his consulship, Cicero sensed that storm clouds were gathering over Rome. But he had no direct proof, only his own brilliantly organized intelligence network. He recruited informants, bribed the conspirators' mistresses, and used all his connections. One of his key agents was Fulvia, a noble matron and the lover of one of the plotters, Quintus Curius. Through her, Cicero learned of Catiline's every move, his every plan. He knew everything, but he could not act. If he arrested Catiline, a noble senator, without irrefutable evidence, he himself would be accused of tyranny and abuse of power. He needed Catiline to make a mistake, to expose himself. And so Cicero began his game. It was a deadly psychological duel. He would attend Senate meetings wearing a breastplate under his toga and surrounded by armed guards, demonstratively showing that he knew about the plot. He hurled veiled accusations at Catiline, trying to provoke him. The climax came on the 8th of November. Catiline, despite his plans being partially known, had the audacity to appear at a Senate meeting in the temple of Jupiter Stator. When he entered, all the senators sitting near him pointedly stood up and moved away, leaving him isolated on the bench like a leper. Then Cicero rose and delivered his first, most famous speech against Catiline. It was not merely a speech. It was the crack of a whip, a verbal flogging. His voice thundered through the temple. Lacking the authority to arrest him, Cicero resolved to drive him from the city with the force of his words. He unleashed such a torrent of accusations, such contemptuous fury, that Catiline, attempting to respond, was drowned out by the senators' shouts of "Enemy! Murderer!" Broken and humiliated, Catiline fled the Senate, and that very night escaped from Rome to the camp of his army in Etruria. Cicero had won. He had forced the enemy to reveal his true colors. Now Catiline was not just a conspirator, but an open rebel leading an army against Rome. However, his chief accomplices remained in the city, ready to start the slaughter and arson at any moment. And once again, Cicero got lucky. The conspirators made a foolish mistake. They tried to involve envoys from the Gallic tribe of the Allobroges, who were in Rome to complain about Roman governors in their plot. The Gauls, frightened, immediately reported everything to Cicero. Like a seasoned director, Cicero set his trap. He instructed the Gauls to pretend to agree and to demand written guarantees from the conspirators, signed with their seals. The plotters, blinded by their imminent success, gave them the letters. As the envoys left Rome by night, they were coincidentally arrested by a detachment sent by Cicero at the Mulvian Bridge. The letters, irrefutable proof of the conspiracy, were in the consul's hands. The next day, he arrested the main conspirators, including the aristocrats Lentulus and Cethegus, and presented their letters to the Senate. The evidence was undeniable. Rome had been saved from a horrific massacre. But now Cicero faced the most difficult question of his life: what to do with the prisoners? Under Roman law, a citizen could not be executed without a trial by the popular assembly, even for high treason. But the situation was an emergency. Catiline's army was at the gates, and riots could break out in the city. Bringing the matter to a public trial was too slow and dangerous. On the 5th of December, the famous Senate meeting was held to decide their fate. Most senators, terrified and thirsty for revenge, leaned toward the death penalty. But then a young praetor named Gaius Julius Caesar took the floor. He delivered a brilliant, cunning speech. He did not defend the conspirators. He spoke of the law. He argued that execution without trial would set a dangerous precedent. Today they execute these men, but tomorrow, under a different power, they might execute you. He proposed sentencing them to life imprisonment in various Italian towns. His speech made a huge impression. The senators wavered. At that moment, Cicero, who had remained silent, realized he was losing the initiative. He gave the floor to Marcus Porcius Cato the Younger, a young Stoic and great-grandson of the famous Cato the Elder, known for his unyielding principles and hatred for all enemies of the Republic. Cato delivered a short but fierce speech, accusing the senators of cowardice and demanding immediate execution. His intervention turned the tide of the debate. A majority voted for the death penalty, and Cicero, the consul tasked with carrying out this decision, took upon himself this terrible responsibility. That very night, without waiting for morning, he personally led the conspirators to the Mamertine prison. There, in the damp, dark dungeon, they were strangled by the executioner's noose. When it was over, Cicero emerged into the forum, where an anxious crowd had gathered, and uttered a single, concise, and chilling word. Rome erupted in celebration. Cicero was carried home on the shoulders of the people. He was hailed as in the Senate, Cato proposed granting him the highest honorary title previously held only by legendary heroes, Pater Patriae. Cicero was at a pinnacle of glory no had ever reached. He had saved the Republic. He was a hero. He was a god. But at that very moment, intoxicated by fame and listening to the crowd's ecstatic cheers, he did not hear the quiet, ominous ticking of a clock. By executing Roman citizens without a trial, even if they were conspirators, he had broken a sacred law. And in doing so, he had handed his enemies a weapon that would one day be used against him with merciless cruelty. His greatest triumph had become the beginning of his end. Glory is the most intoxicating and fleeting of drinks. After crushing the Catiline Conspiracy, Cicero savored it. He was not just a consul, he was Pater Patriae, the father of the fatherland. He had saved Rome, and he never missed an opportunity to remind everyone of it. In his speeches, letters, and private conversations, he returned again and again to his consulship, his vigilance, his decisiveness. He even wrote an epic poem about his deeds, which, to the ridicule of his enemies, began with the famously self-aggrandizing line, "O fortunate Rome, born in my consulate." His vanity, previously just a character trait, grew to monstrous proportions. He sincerely believed he had earned the Republic's eternal gratitude, and that his authority was now unassailable. This was his greatest mistake. While he was basking in his triumph, the political landscape of Rome was changing rapidly. New, far more powerful players were emerging, titans whose ambitions could no longer be contained within the framework of the old republic. The first was Gnaeus Pompey, called the Great. He had just returned from the east after a series of brilliant victories over pirates and King Mithridates, bringing with him immense treasures and an army of veterans loyal to him alone. He was the most popular man in Rome. The second was Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, who had amassed his fortune from fires and Sulla's proscriptions. He was not a great general, but his money gave him enormous influence. And the third, still a dark horse, was Gaius Julius Caesar, the nephew of Marius, who had barely escaped Sulla. He was a populist genius, an idol of the urban masses who lavishly spent on games and festivals, sinking into colossal debt while slowly but surely building his political career. Cicero, with his immense authority, could have become a rallying point for all moderate forces who feared these new monarchs. He dreamed of a concordia ordinum, a harmony of the orders, an alliance between the Senate and the equestrians that would protect the Republic. But his vanity and political short-sightedness prevented him. He failed to see that his era, the era of orators and lawyers, was ending. The age of generals and legions was dawning. These three giants, Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar, hated and distrusted one another. But they hated and distrusted the Senate even more, for it feared their power and obstructed their plans. In 60 BC, Caesar, returning from his governorship in Spain, made a brilliant move. He persuaded his two rivals, Pompey and Crassus, to unite, not against Rome's enemies, but against Rome itself, against its lawful institutions. They formed a secret, private pact that became known as the First Triumvirate. It was not an official office like that of Octavian and Antony. It was a conspiracy of the three most powerful men in the state, who swore to support each other and to block any decision displeasing to even one of them. The Republic, without knowing it, had been condemned. They tried to draw Cicero into their alliance. His authority would have given their conspiracy a veneer of legitimacy. Caesar personally offered him high posts, a place on his staff. But Cicero, for all his vanity, was a sincere Republican. He understood that this alliance meant death to everything he believed in, and he refused. It was a brave, principled act, and it cost him everything. Rejected by the triumvirs, he was left alone. They decided to destroy him, to teach a lesson to all others. But they didn't do it themselves. They found the perfect instrument, a man who harbored a personal burning hatred for Cicero. His name was Publius Clodius Pulcher. Clodius was a demagogic aristocrat, an unscrupulous adventurer, and a master of street terror. His hatred for Cicero had been born several years earlier during a scandalous trial. Clodius, disguised as a woman, had infiltrated the exclusively female rites of the Bona Dea, held at Caesar's own house, to meet with his wife. It was an unprecedented sacrilege. When he was put on trial, Cicero, despite pleas from many aristocrats, testified and destroyed his alibi. Clodius was acquitted through bribery, but held a mortal grudge. Now, with the triumvir's blessing, he got his chance for revenge. Caesar, as consul, helped Clodius illegally transfer from patrician to plebeian status so he could be elected tribune of the plebs. Upon gaining this office, Clodius immediately proposed a law. It was cunningly worded, without naming names. Anyone who has executed a Roman citizen without trial and due process shall be exiled. But everyone in Rome understood who it was aimed at. It was aimed at Cicero and his decision in the case of the Catiline conspirators. Cicero was horrified. He had not expected such a blow. He rushed around the city, humiliatingly begging for help. He dressed in mourning, covered his head with ash, and walked the streets imploring senators and equestrians to protect him. Many sympathized, but no one dared to oppose the will of the triumvirs. Pompey, who owed his support to Cicero, cowardly left the city. Caesar, stationed with his legions at the gates of Rome, hypocritically offered him a safe position on his staff. Cicero realized he had been betrayed by all. To avoid a formal trial that would have ended in a death sentence, he made a bitter decision. He went into voluntary exile. The father of the fatherland fled Rome like a criminal. Immediately after his departure, Clodius passed a second law that personally named Cicero an exile, confiscated all his property, and burned his luxurious house on the Palatine Hill to the ground, dedicating the site to the goddess Liberty. Exile was hell for Cicero. For a man who had spent his entire life in the spotlight, at the height of fame, to be torn from Rome, stripped of his status, his home, his country, was a torture worse than death. He wandered through Greece, plunged into a deep depression. His letters from this period are a cry of despair. He cursed his enemies, lamented the betrayal of his friends, and reproached himself for his cowardice. He contemplated suicide. "Why should I live?" he wrote to his friend Atticus. "I have lost everything." The man who had so courageously stood up to Catiline was completely broken by personal disaster. But the political winds in Rome were changing again. Clodius, drunk with power, began to spin out of control. His armed gangs terrorized the city, and he even dared to challenge Pompey. Humiliated and insulted, Pompey realized he had made a mistake by allowing Cicero to be destroyed. He needed a counterweight to Caesar, whose fame in Gaul was growing by the day, and he needed an ally against Clodius. He decided to bring Cicero back. A long political struggle for his return began. It took more than a year, the intervention of the Senate, the support of Pompey, and finally the tacit consent of Caesar, who no longer saw Cicero as a serious threat. In August of 57 BC, the law of exile was repealed. Cicero's return to Rome was triumphant. The entire city seemed to turn out to greet him. Crowds cheered him all the way from Brundisium to the capital. He wrote, his property was returned, and his house was rebuilt at public expense. It appeared he was on top again, but it was only an illusion. He returned to a different Rome, a Rome where the Republic was nothing more than a facade behind which three men ruled. He tried to play his old games, to become an independent figure again, maneuvering between Pompey and Caesar, trying to set them against each other. But he quickly and painfully realized that he was no longer a player. He was merely a piece in their game. In 56 BC, the triumvirs met at Lucca and extended their powers, dividing the world among themselves for the next 5 years. Caesar received Gaul for another 5 years. Pompey got Spain, and Crassus got Syria. And they demanded Cicero's complete and unconditional submission. He was forced to humiliatingly deliver praise-filled speeches in the Senate for Caesar, his recent enemy. It was a bitter pill, but he swallowed it. He understood that his time had passed. He withdrew from active politics and immersed himself once more in what he did best: philosophy and rhetoric. He wrote his great treatises on the Republic, on the laws, and on the Orator, trying to preserve on paper the ideal image of a republic that was already dead in reality. But history would not let him retire in peace. In 53 BC, Crassus was killed in Parthia. The fragile balance of the triumvirate was broken. Only two remained: Pompey in Rome and Caesar in Gaul. Their clash was becoming inevitable. The Republic was rapidly sliding toward a new civil war, one even more terrible than the war between Marius and Sulla. And Cicero, the man who hated civil wars more than anything, would have to make the most agonizing choice of his life. The death of Crassus in the hot sands of Mesopotamia was the death knell for the First Triumvirate, and with it, for the last remnants of peace in the Republic. The fragile alliance, held together by a balance of ambition and fear, collapsed. Only two remained: Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus and Gaius Julius Caesar. And the world had become too small for both of them. They were not just rivals. They represented two different models of power, two different futures for Rome. Pompey, once the great conqueror, now positioned himself as the defender of the senatorial aristocracy, a symbol of the old order, though he himself had repeatedly broken its laws. He was in Rome, surrounded by senators, his power at least outwardly legitimate. Caesar, having spent nearly a decade in Gaul, had become something more than just a general. He was a living legend, the idol of his legions, who had gone through fire and water with him and were devoted to him as to a god. His popularity with the people of Rome, fueled by tales of his victories and the vast sums of money he sent to the city, was boundless. He embodied a new monarchical power, based not on law, but on personal charisma and the loyalty of his army. Their collision was as inevitable as the changing of the seasons. And Marcus Tullius Cicero, the greatest intellectual of his time, found himself at the epicenter of this impending earthquake. For him, this was not just a political struggle, it was a personal tragedy. He had ties to both men. Pompey was his old patron, the man who had helped him return from exile, though he had lacked the resolve to protect him initially. Cicero respected him but did not trust him, seeing him as a vain and indecisive politician. Caesar, on the other hand, was indebted to him. Cicero had once saved him from the wrath of the Optimatus. He admired Caesar's genius, his energy, his clemency, but at the same time he feared him viscerally. He saw in him a future dictator, the grave-digger of the Republic. The entire aristocracy, the entire Senate, demanded that he choose a side. But he couldn't. He was torn apart. "Whom shall I join?" he wrote in despair to his friend Atticus. "Pompey has the honorable cause, but Caesar is the more successful. I know whom to flee, but not whom to follow." He understood that no matter which side he chose, the Republic would lose. He saw that Pompey, fighting under the Senate's banner, would establish a Sulla-style dictatorship if he won. And Caesar, for all his charm, was even more dangerous. He wrote prophetically. He desperately tried to prevent the war. He wrote pleading letters to both leaders, proposed compromises, and spoke in the Senate with calls for peace. He became the leading in Rome. But his words, which had once stopped conspiracies, were now powerless. They were drowned out by the clash of arms. In January of 49 BC, after the Senate, incited by Caesar's enemies, issued him an ultimatum, Gaius Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon River, the border of Italy, with his 13th legion, and uttered his famous words, "The die is cast." The civil war had begun. Pompey and most of the Senate, unprepared for such a swift turn of events, fled Rome in a panic, and then Italy itself, crossing to Greece to assemble an army. Caesar occupied the capital, virtually unopposed. He immediately began pressuring Cicero to stay in Rome and support him, to lend his cause an air of legitimacy. Their meeting, described by Cicero himself, was tense. Caesar was charming. He flattered, persuaded, and made promises. But Cicero, mustering all his courage, refused. He could not betray the Republic, even if its defenders were repugnant to him. "If I do not join Pompey," he said, "where am I to go?" After long, agonizing hesitation, cursing both sides, he made his choice, a choice of honor, not advantage. He crossed to Greece and joined Pompey's camp. But what he saw there horrified him. The Republican camp was filled with arrogant, bloodthirsty aristocrats who were already dividing up future government posts and drawing up proscription lists of their enemies. They spoke not of saving the Republic, but of revenge and plunder. Pompey, their leader, was indecisive and constantly deferred to the senators' opinions. Cicero, with his sharp tongue and pessimistic forecasts, was an outsider. His sarcasm irritated everyone. When Pompey asked him where his son-in-law was, Cicero replied, "He is with your father-in-law," referring to Caesar. He felt like a stranger in this camp of the doomed. In 48 BC, at the Battle of Pharsalus, Caesar's army, outnumbered nearly 2-1, decisively crushed Pompey's legions. It was the end. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was treacherously murdered. The Republican cause was lost. Cicero, who had not participated in the battle due to his chronic illness, was crushed. He refused to lead the remnants of the army and fleet, which angered Cato, and decided to surrender to the victor's mercy. He awaited his fate in Brundisium, tormented by fear and uncertainty. He knew that victors in civil wars were not usually merciful to their enemies. But Caesar was not Sulla. He proclaimed a policy of clemencia, or mercy. He pardoned his enemies, gave them positions, and tried to reconcile the fractured society. When he returned to Italy, he met with Cicero. He dismounted his horse, embraced him, and walked alongside him for a long time, talking to him like an old friend. He did not just forgive him, he restored his dignity. Cicero was stunned. He had not expected such magnanimity. He returned to Rome and once again withdrew from politics, which now depended entirely on the will of one man. He immersed himself in philosophy again. It was during these years, the years of Caesar's dictatorship, that he wrote his finest philosophical works. It was his way of coping with reality, his internal exile. He had accepted it. He acknowledged that the Republic was dead and tried to find his place in the new world. He even began delivering praise-filled speeches for the dictator in the Senate, urging him to restore republican institutions. But beneath the ashes of this resignation, the embers of his old faith still glowed. He could never fully accept a monarchy, not even the monarchy of a genius. And on the Ides of March in 44 BC, when a group of senators led by Marcus Junius Brutus, a descendant of the Republic's legendary founder, plunged 23 daggers into Caesar's body, Cicero was in the chamber. He was not part of the conspiracy. They had not let him in on their plans, likely considering him too talkative and indecisive. But when it was over, and Brutus, raising his bloody dagger, shouted the name of one man in the ensuing silence to symbolically hand him the restored republic, he shouted the name of Cicero. For Cicero, it was a moment of terror and elation. The republic was saved. But he, more than anyone, understood the terrible price that would be paid for this blood. He saw that the death of one tyrant had not resurrected the republic, but had merely opened Pandora's box, from which new, even more terrifying monsters of civil war were about to emerge. And he, a 62-year-old man, was destined to play his greatest and final role in this last, deadly drama. The assassination of Caesar did not bring freedom to Rome. It brought chaos. The Brutus and Cassius naively believed that by killing the tyrant, they would automatically resurrect the republic. But they failed to account for two things: the will of the Roman people, who adored Caesar, and the ambitions of his lieutenants. The city did not greet them as heroes. It froze in anxious anticipation. The Senate, paralyzed by fear, did not know what to do. And real power, as is always the case in Rome, fell into the hands of the man with the legions and the money. That man was Mark Antony. Antony, consul and Caesar's closest associate, was initially disoriented, but he quickly took control of the situation. He seized Caesar's treasury and archives, giving him both money and legal leverage. He made a temporary truce with the conspirators, allowing them to remain in the city. But his real weapon was Caesar's funeral. In the Forum, before a huge, grieving crowd, he delivered his famous funeral oration. He did not immediately call for revenge. He was more cunning. He read Caesar's will, in which the dictator left his gardens to the people and bequeathed 300 sesterces to every citizen. Then he tore the shroud from Caesar's body and showed the crowd his mangled, bloody corpse, his 23 wounds. The crowd's grief instantly turned to blind rage. Enraged plebeians and veterans, using benches and tables from the Forum as a funeral pyre, cremated their idol's body. Then, armed with burning torches, they rushed to destroy the conspirators' homes. Brutus and Cassius were forced to flee Rome. Antony became the master of the city. Cicero, who had initially hailed Caesar's murder as a glorious divine banquet, watched these events with horror. He saw one tyrant replaced by another, one even more brutish and unpredictable. He despised Antony, considering him a drunkard, a debauchee, and a threat to the Republic. At first, he stayed at his villas, fearing for his life. But he could not remain silent. His nature, his vanity, his sincere belief in Republican ideals demanded action. He decided his final battle would be a battle of words. He returned to Rome, and starting on September 2nd, 44 BC, began delivering a series of speeches against Mark Antony in the Senate, which he, in an allusion to Demosthenes' speeches against the king of Macedon, called this was the pinnacle of his oratorical art, and at the same time, his political suicide. He did not just criticize Antony. He tried to destroy him, to grind him to dust with the power of his eloquence. He unleashed the full force of his sarcasm, his anger, his contempt. He accused him of every mortal sin: cowardice, drunkenness, debauchery, embezzlement, usurpation of power. He thundered in the Senate. In total, he delivered 14 such speeches. Each one was sharper than a dagger. He achieved his goal. The Senate, inspired by his courage, grew bold and eventually declared Antony, and but with these same speeches, Cicero signed his own death warrant. Antony would never forgive him for this humiliation. But to defeat Antony, the Senate had no army. And then a new, unexpected player entered the scene. 18-year-old Gaius Octavius, Caesar's great-nephew, whom he had adopted in his will. He arrived in Italy and, taking the name Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, began to act. Cicero, like everyone in Rome, initially dismissed him. He saw him as just a boy, ambitious but inexperienced. And he decided to make what he considered his most brilliant political move. He would use this boy as a weapon against Antony. Cicero became Octavian's chief sponsor in the Senate. He persuaded the senators to legalize the private army the youth had raised from Caesar's veterans. He secured for him, a 19-year-old, unprecedented honors, the rank of senator and the authority of a propraetor. He believed he could manipulate him. In his letters, he cynically wrote, "The young man should be praised, honored, and disposed of. Laudandum ornandum tollendum." The last word, tollendum, had a double meaning: to raise up and to eliminate. Cicero thought that after defeating Antony with Octavian's help, he could easily get rid of the boy himself and restore the Senate's power. It was the most tragic mistake of his life. He, the great judge of human character, failed to see in this quiet, polite youth an icy will and ruthlessness that surpassed his own. In the spring of 43 BC, the combined army of the Senate's consuls and Octavian defeated Antony at the Battle of Mutina. Antony fled to Gaul. The Republic, it seemed, was saved. Cicero was jubilant. He was at the height of his influence, effectively the informal head of the government. But his triumph was short-lived. Both consuls died in the battle, leaving the entire victorious army under Octavian's command. And when the Senate, deciding the boy was no longer needed, denied him a triumph and the consulship, Octavian did what Cicero had never expected. He turned his legions around and marched on Rome. Cicero and the senators were terrified. They tried to negotiate, pleaded, and made promises. But it was too late. Octavian entered the city and forced them to elect him consul. The boy, whom Cicero had intended to use and dispose of, had become his master. His first act was a law revoking the amnesty for Caesar's assassins. His second was to form an alliance with his recent enemies. On a small island in a river, Octavian, Mark Antony, who had already raised a new army in Gaul, and another Caesarian, Lepidus, met and formed the Second Triumvirate. It was an official, legalized dictatorship of 3 men. Their alliance was sealed in blood. To raise money for the war against Brutus and Cassius, and to eliminate all their enemies in Italy, they issued proscriptions. Once again, as in Sulla's time, death lists appeared in the Forum. And Antony, in forging this alliance, made one non-negotiable demand. In exchange for the lives of several of his own relatives, whom Octavian wanted to execute, he demanded a single life: the life of Marcus Tullius Cicero. Octavian hesitated. He owed Cicero everything. But he was not a sentimental youth. He was a cold-blooded politician. After 2 days of arguments, he gave in. He betrayed and handed over for slaughter the man who had been his greatest benefactor, who had called him a divine youth and had brought him to power. News of the proscriptions reached Cicero at his villa in Tusculum. He understood everything. He knew his name would be first on Antony's list. His brother Quintus begged him to flee, and they tried to escape together. But their paths diverged. Quintus was soon found and killed along with his son. Cicero, tormented by indecision, wavered. He would board a ship to sail to Macedonia to join Brutus, then return to shore, cursing his fate. He was old, sick, and exhausted. He said in despair. Finally, his slaves, who were loyal to him to the end, literally forced him into a litter and carried him toward the coast, toward the last ship. But it was too late. Antony's soldiers, a detachment led by the centurion Herennius, were already on his trail. They caught up with him in a forest near his villa. His slaves wanted to fight to protect their master, but Cicero forbade them. He ordered them to stop and set the litter down. He calmly, with a dignity that had often deserted him in moments of political crisis, but returned to him in the face of death, looked out from behind the curtain. He looked his murderers in the eye. He was 63 years old. He was unshaven, exhausted, but his gaze was steady. According to Livy, he himself stretched out his neck for the centurion's sword. On the 7th of December, 43 BC, the greatest orator and defender of the Republic was killed. But Antony's revenge did not end there. He ordered that not only Cicero's head, but also his right hand, the very hand that had written the Philippics, be cut off. These gruesome trophies were brought to Rome, and by Antony's command, nailed to the rostra in the Forum, the very speaker's platform from which Cicero had so often spoken in defense of the Republic. Antony's wife, Fulvia, who hated Cicero as much as her husband, came to see the spectacle. According to legend, she pulled a golden hairpin from her hair and repeatedly pierced the dead tongue of the orator who had caused her so much grief. Thus ended the life of Marcus Tullius Cicero. And so, in essence, ended the history of the Roman Republic. The word had been definitively conquered by the sword. So who was he? The greatest orator, a wise philosopher, a courageous father of the fatherland, who defended the dying republic to his last breath. Undoubtedly. But was he also a vain, indecisive, and naive schemer, who often made fatal errors in his political games, underestimated his enemies, and was ultimately betrayed and destroyed by the very forces he himself had helped bring to power? Also, undoubtedly, his tragedy is the tragedy of a moderate man in an age of extremes. He tried to find compromise where none could exist. He tried to appeal to the law where legions made the decisions. He was the last great voice of the Republic, but that voice spoke at a moment when the world had already gone deaf from the clash of arms. And yet, his legacy proved more durable than that of his murderers. The empires of Caesar and Augustus collapsed, but Cicero's words, his speeches, his philosophy, his ideals of republican liberty survived the centuries and became a cornerstone of all European political thought, inspiring the founding fathers of the United States and the leaders of the French Revolution. In the end, his fragile, vulnerable word proved stronger than their swords.